Everyone says climate change is about carbon emissions, but no one really explains what that means or why they are still rising, if even after decades of pledges and warnings. So I wanted to understand that, and I decided to build a personal footprint calculator, just to see where my emissions were coming from. And once I saw the data, it clicked. The emissions, they're not random. They follow one simple equation that explains why the emissions keep rising, but also where the real change is possible. And here's the hopeful part. The latest survey data shows that the vast majority of people, 9 out of 10 people across the world, want more climate action. So the majority of your family, friends, co-workers, we're all on the same side. We just don't really know what to do. So I'll share with you the equation, the framework that I now use, so you can finally understand this rising emissions problem. And more importantly, you'll know what you can do to reduce your own personal footprint. It all begins with this. Total emissions equal population multiplied by the average emissions per person. Now, to fully understand this equation, we need to dive a little bit deeper, add a couple of numbers. I'll use a brilliant non-profit, Our World in Data. If you like number crunching and exploring data, I highly recommend a visit. In 2023, we emitted 53 billion tons of CO2 equivalent into the atmosphere. There were 8 billion people in 2023. That increased from 5.3 billion in 1990. And that means that we were emitting roughly 6.7 tons per person per year in 2023. So we can add these numbers into our equation. And now, metaphors are quite useful to understand this problem. And the annual emissions are similar to an open tap of water that is flowing and keeps emitting new emissions into the atmosphere every year. We often imagine that slowing emissions will stop climate change. But that's not how physics works. Once we emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and especially CO2, that stays there for centuries. And yes, there are natural variations in the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, but if we have a look over the last 10,000 years, or if we zoom out, have a look at the last million years, we can see that the current levels are breaking all sorts of records. So the atmosphere acts like a bathtub. It accumulates more and more of those emissions. And here's the shocking truth. Half of all the CO2 emissions occurred within the last 30 years. And so far, we've emitted over 1,800 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And the so what? Well, the good news is that any ton of CO2 you avoid today stays avoided forever. It has a permanent impact. To recap, we now understand that the emissions, they act like a tap of water. They keep filling that bathtub with emissions. The next question is, where do all the emissions come from? And the answer is that it's the modern life. And the richer the country, the economy becomes, the more we tend to emit. Because the richer we get, we build bigger houses that need more heating, we travel more, we consume more goods. And if we have a look by sector, there are clear 4 biggest drivers of emissions. And that's the energy, the electricity, and the heating. It's the transport, but also manufacturing, construction, and agriculture also are the key drivers of emissions. So if you are now motivated to start reviewing where your emissions are coming from, these are the 4 sectors that I would have a look at. Burning of fossil fuels causes the emissions. But if the wealth is a good indicator of where the majority of the emissions are coming from, then we probably need to have a look at that average emissions per person. Just to recap, the total greenhouse gas emissions were at 6.7 tons per person per year. Out of that, the vast majority, that's the CO2 emissions at 4.6 tons. So does that mean that we all need to halve our emissions? And that's how we solve the climate crisis? Oxfam have just released a really great report on this. I'll add the link in the comments below. Because we often hear that we are all in this together. We all need to solve the climate crisis together. But that's not quite right. If we have a look at the Oxfam numbers, we can see that the poorest 50% of people emit just 0.8 tons of CO2 per year. The middle 40 emit 5.1 tons per person, so roughly average. Then we can see that the richest 10% emit 22 tons, or 4 times more than the world average. And they account for almost half of all the emissions. And if we zoom in even further into the top 10 emitters, we can see that the top 9 emit 13 tons, top 1% 75 tons per year, and the top 0.1 emit 298 tons per year. To put this into perspective, 0.8 of a ton, that's the weight of a very small car. Now when you get to the richest 9%, 13 tons, that's a solid truck. 75 tons gets you a locomotive. And 988 tons, that's the same like a small super yacht. I promised I would give some practical advice on how you can make a real difference as we go through the equation and the deep dives. And the so what here is quite straightforward. You need to calculate your carbon footprint and understand it. You can use the free calculator available on the Fernall.com, or there are other calculators available on the internet. Because if your personal footprint is significantly above the average, that also means that you have a bigger opportunity to make a real difference, because the climate crisis is not going to be solved by the poorest 50% who already emit very little. Finally, the hardest point to grasp, just the sheer scale of the emissions that we're talking about. With an average person emitting 6.7 tons per year, it can be tempting to start considering whether there is some technology, or perhaps we could use trees to offset rather than reduce the emissions. But to offset even a single person's worth of emissions, we would need an additional 1 to 2 football pitches of forest. Now multiply that by 8 billion people, and we're talking about doubling or even tripling all the forests on Earth. And that's not going to happen. We don't even have enough space for all of this. So yes, plants are important, but only for the very final emissions that can't be avoided at all. So what? Well, that means that all of us, we need to focus on reduction and not removal. And it's key to cut the emissions at source. When I first started researching this, I felt overwhelmed. The scale, the science, the politics. But once you break it down and you see the math, the logic, you understand what we actually need to do. And the more people understand, the faster we can fix it together. And remember that latest survey data. It shows that 9 in 10, almost everyone, wants more climate action. We're not divided. We're just waiting for direction and some clarity. So share this video with your family and friends, or just start the conversation. Because if all of us, if we start acting, talking, choosing differently, everything else will follow. And that's what we're building here at Fernall. A community that learns, questions, and figures out what actually works. So if you'd like, subscribe, join the discussion below, And in the next video, we'll use the Fernall calculator to compare a couple of different lifestyles and see which changes make the biggest difference. See you next time. You also want to be in the video? Supervisor.